Thank you, and good evening. Is this on? Great. It's definitely a privilege being up here, and it's a bit nerve-wracking, particularly because I don't think I'd realized that I was going to be speaking this evening until a few minutes ago. So you're getting this very fresh and a little bit unstructured, so bear with me. The proverbial Africa, I spent a bit of time on the walk over here thinking about a proverb or a saying or something that might be instructive for anchoring a conversation about what I see of the continent, which leaves me so deeply excited and optimistic about the future. And I thought actually a saying which a few of my former colleagues from Dalberg who may be in the crowd, or others who may have met with me at different points will be sick of hearing me say, might be appropriate for me to repeat here. So if you've heard me say this before, please don't hold it against me. I'm not sure it counts as a proverb, but it's a saying my old high school principal used to use often when trying to encourage a degree of humility among us. And it went, they who think they're too big to do little things are generally too small to do big things. And I'll talk about that in three different contexts. I think the most obvious one is as you think about careers, and a lot of people here are among that exciting generation of Africans who are getting the opportunity to study at an exalted institution of this nature and then hopefully go back to contribute to the transformation of the continent. And I'll start with that. My own journey, I had the opportunity to study at a relatively well-known school, work at well-known firms, etc. And over the years, I've observed people, quote unquote, coming back to the continent. And one of the things that struck me, and that's always important to bear in mind, is that Africa's talent is deep and widespread. The determinant of who gets the opportunity to sit here at Oxford, or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in New Haven, or at INSEAD and elsewhere, is often more luck and random chance than pure merit. No offense to the wonderfully meritorious people here present. But that's actually good news. And it's important to bear that in mind, because as you return, I think prior generations, you've seen a bit of this mentality that says, I am a conquering hero, lauded by the external world, bow before me and carve a path for me to play my leadership role that is my rightful due. Whereas, one, there are people who never left, who are smarter than you, who have been there working hard. And two, yes, you've studied and been lauded outside, but you don't know that much about how the Africa you left behind actually works. And so a degree of humility, a degree of openness to meeting the continent where it is, and meeting peers of different backgrounds where they are, is critical to actually being a true agent of change and building a career of significance in the continent, certainly in my view. The second lens I'll take to this notion of being whether you're big or little and what you accomplish, is just the story of my own kind of experience of building a business on the continent. When we started Dalberg 15 years ago, it was with this idea of focusing on international development and then more broadly on inclusive and sustainable growth. And when I moved almost exactly 10 years ago to Johannesburg, it was just the idea, well, maybe we can start a little bit of a presence for Dalberg in Africa. Today, Africa accounts for more than half of what Dalberg does. We have 7 offices on the continent. And it's been a tremendous ride and really gaining momentum. The interesting thing, though, is that so many of the roots of the work we're doing today, which often is exciting, high profile, highly visible, sit in invisible, small projects done years ago in the depths of government institutions, NGOs, etc., in countries that were not getting attention from investors or global businesses, right? And the interesting thing is engaging early, opening your eye again to the continent as it is and to opportunity that may not look big to begin with, but where actually the logic of where it goes is compelling, actually unlocks a tremendous amount of value. So again, being willing to take the call from that small company in country X years ago meant that by the time they were big, well, we had an established relationship. Spending time working on the early stages of post-conflict recovery or building up the beginnings of social protection systems, et cetera, in certain countries meant that when those countries transitioned from being donor darlings to being investment targets, we could actually speak to a track record of having worked there for many years. So as you think about how you're framing your own investments and strategies across the continent, too often you hear, well, there are only 2 or 3 markets big enough in Africa to be significant. Well, if they're already big enough now, the chance to establish yourself as one of the builders of that economy is already gone. The question is not who's big today, the question is who's going to be big 5, 10 years from now. And what is your role in getting them there? And if you can see a distinctive role for yourself, then get there early, not late. Don't wait for someone else to prove it out. And I'll make that tangible with a concrete example that is one of the more exciting pieces of work that we've been involved with. So about 6, 7 years ago, we were invited by the World Bank to look at the question of off-grid power, off-grid energy. What was the potential for solar home systems, you know, the panel and the 4 lights in a house? What was the potential for that as a solution for energy in Africa? At the time, we ran our numbers, et cetera, and the idea was actually this is a product for the poor. It'll be a contribution to social welfare, and maybe there may be some small businesses that come out of it. The numbers suggested that there was a vast potential, that the vast majority of Africa's households were and were likely to remain off-grid for the foreseeable future, and were spending upwards of $10 billion a year on various energy solutions in the home. And we said, well, if this is all true, then the potential market for off-grid solutions is vast, continues to expand, and we see the potential for this industry to grow at upwards of 100% a year for many years into the future. As we wrote this down, we wanted to check the numbers ourselves. We couldn't believe it, right? It doesn't really make sense. And we tried to bias everything down. The industry substantially exceeded our most optimistic projections. And some of you in the room actually will be very familiar with the fact that over the last 3 or 4 years, 5 or 6 companies, many of which based a lot of their early strategies on some of the early work that we did on this sector, have gone on to raise money at valuations in excess of $100 million. Right? These are relatively early stage companies working in East Africa, beginning to scale up at the intersection of energy and telecommunications, building the tools. When you think about it, this is an example of the Internet of Things applied in a frontier market in a way that actually is ahead of where we see some of the more advanced markets going. Right? And that's an example of where thinking about the actual need of a typical African household, meeting them where they are, thinking small, but then also thinking big, can unlock massive and really, truly endless opportunity in a way that contributes not just to commercial success, but to inclusive growth and hopefully a more sustainable planet for all. So food for thought, and as we engage in the conference, in the conversations, I look forward to sharing and hearing more from you. But again, I come back to that earlier point. You will miss all of these opportunities in Africa if you think you're too big. You're too big to do the little things, because frankly, that probably means you're too little to do the big things. Thank you very much.